I totally neglected to mention earlier. So we really fancy ourselves here of being a kid-friendly church and wanting kids to have access to this space as much as they have access to our children's rooms. That this space is as much for them as it is for any grown-up. That being said, my message this morning is going to be PG-13. And so if you're a parent and our attempt to be kid-friendly to you, I would encourage you to walk your kid back right now. We're not going to talk about like sexuality, but we are going to talk about some ancient violence, some brutality that happened in the ancient world. And so I'm going to have some ancient pictures, some reliefs from about 3,000 years ago that I'm going to show that depict some of this violence. So if there's anything in that make make you uncomfortable or might make you your children uncomfortable, just want to kind of give you a heads up warning now because to understand the book of Jonah, we have to engage with the reality of the world in which Jonah lived. So that being said, if you want to leave, no judgment. Feel free to walk your kids back, or if it's something you're uncomfortable with, you're welcome to walk too. That's okay. Around the year 750 BC, almost 3,000 years ago, a new king came to be the emperor, ascended to the throne of the ancient Assyrian Empire. His birth name was Pulu. But let's just be honest. Ain't nobody going to take you seriously as king if your name is Pulu. So when he ascended to the throne and was coronated, he changed his regal name to Tiglath-Pileser III. And buddy, was he ambitious. Very quickly, he set about conquering as much of the known world as he could. And he extended and created an Assyrian empire that was the largest the world had ever seen up until that point in history. He conquered lands as far east as Iran, modern-day Iran, and then he went west into Turkey. He went down the east side of the Mediterranean Sea, and he went as far south as Egypt, creating, again, the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point in time. The man was relentless. In fact, along his way, around the year 730 BC, he conquered a tiny little kingdom of tribes that we now know today as Israel, spreading their people all over. When his son assumed the throne, his son was Sargon II. Sargon II had the same kind of expansionist ideas. That was what he wanted. That was his program, was to continue to expand the empire. However, as a new king, nobody took him seriously. Everybody thought there was no way he could be as mean or as powerful as his daddy. And so for the first several years of his rule, he had to put down all of these internal revolts happening within the empire. One of those revolts came from Palestine. There was there a regional governor by the name of Yao-Bedi. Yao-Bedi had been put into the governorship by Tiglath-Pileser III. But Yao-Bedi could not stand the Assyrians. He had watched his people be brutalized. In fact, interestingly enough, we suspect that Yao-Bedi's name is a variant form of Yahweh, God's name. If that's true, then it means that Yao-Bedi was an Israelite. He was one of those people that had been conquered by the Assyrians, and even though Tiglath had put him in charge as governor of the region, Yao-Bedi resented, we think, the brutality, the conquest that had been placed upon him. And so Yao-Bedi gathers up some other regional governors, and they form an army, and they revolt in the year 721 BC from Sargon II, the new king. Their revolt causes some problems, and it takes a year for Sargon II to get his act together. But he will have none of it. He is going to make sure that these people fall in line. A year after Yao-Bedi's revolt, Sargon marched on Palestine. His army met the army of Yao-Bedi and those other regional governors on the Orontes River in modern-day Lebanon. And Yao-Bedi's army was decimated. Yao-Bedi himself was captured. And Sargon decided it was time to send a message to everybody else in the empire. So he publicly executed Yao-Bedi You see it in the picture on the screens right now. He executed him publicly by skinning him alive. He then proceeded to salt the skin of Yalbadi and sent it on a tour of the empire to make sure everybody knew this is what happens when you mess with an Assyrian emperor. The Assyrians were absolutely brutal. The Neo-Assyrian Empire lasted more than 300 years, and like every empire before it and since, it founded itself and it sustained itself through violence. Forcing people underneath their thumb was the way you had control. But the Assyrians took it to an entirely new level. In fact, we in the West, we civilize people. Let's just tell the truth. We look back on the ancient world and we see all of it as extremely barbaric, don't we? I'm not so sure it's fair of us to look back on 3,000 years of history and think that we're any better than them, that we're any less barbaric. But the truth of the matter is, those folks did invent the phrase eye for an eye. They were the people who invented forms of torture that we still now use. But it is worth pointing out that the Assyrians took it to an entirely new level. They absolutely went above and beyond to try to make their atrocities as shocking and as surprising as possible. And I think they met their goal. Even by their own reckoning 3,000 years ago, what the Assyrians did would be considered war crimes. In fact, the prophet Amos in the Bible says as much. I'll give you a couple examples. The Assyrian emperor, Ashur-Narsipal II, about 150 years before Sargon II salted the skin of Yalbadi. Well, Ashur-Narsipal claimed in one of his conquests, he had this inscribed, I quote, he said, I captured many troops alive. From some I cut off their arms and hands. From others I cut off their noses, their ears, and their extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I hung their heads on trees around the city. I burned alive many of their adolescent boys and girls. And 150 years before Ashur-Narsipal II, which is 300 years before Sargon II, Tiglath-Pileser I had poems written about himself that declared this, I quote, he slits the wombs of pregnant women open. He plucks out the eyes of infants. He slits the throats of their strong ones. You see the pictures on the screens of how the Assyrians commemorated themselves in this regard. This is a relief that they carved into their capital city of Nineveh of prisoners being skinned alive. This is what it would have looked like for them. And I think it's worth pointing out what I just read and the images you have seen. This is how the Assyrians understood themselves. How do you think their victims and the people they conquered them saw them? Because once you start to get there, you start to reckon with the reality that Jonah, the prophet, the son of Amittai, he lived right smack dab in the middle of all of this. This was his world. He lived in an insignificant, powerless kingdom, at least from the perspective of Assyria. And his little nation, Israel, was sandwiched between the world's two great empires of the time, Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. And there was no question in the 8th century BC who was ascendant, who had all the power. Assyria dominated everything in the political, economic life, social life of the Middle East at that time period. The question a guy like Jonah and his people would have had in the year 750 BC wouldn't have been, when are the Assyrians going to come and commit atrocities? The question they would have had was, just how many atrocities are they going to commit? They would have lived in absolute terror of the empire to their north. And so, when the book of Jonah opens, and I still have marked from my Sunday school class this morning. When the book of Jonah opens with God's call to Jonah, is it any surprise his response? The text goes, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and cry out against it." I ask you, brothers and sisters, if you were Jonah, son of Amittai, and you had the contextual knowledge I just gave you, what would you have done? Because I know what I would have done. I'm not a man of courage, and I need a head start because I don't move fast. If your name was Jonah and your daddy's name was Amittai, what would you have done? My guess is you'd have been on the boat with me. Look, Nineveh in the 8th century BC is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. It's the ancient heart of darkness. It's Mordor. And Jonah is Frodo. Oh, y'all didn't understand that one. Nineveh is the Death Star, and Jonah is Luke. Oh, well, some more of us got that one. I got it, all right. I don't know what your thing is. Look, Nineveh is Azkaban. It's the Bates Motel. It's Crystal Lake, Camp Crystal Lake. You didn't go there. You stayed away from it, particularly if you were from Israel or any other of those conquered nations. It was the belly of the beast. Asking an 8th century Israelite to go to Nineveh would have been like asking a Jew in 1940 to go to Berlin. You wouldn't have done it. And yet this is the call on Jonah's life. What would you have done? But maybe here's a more important question. Where is Nineveh for you today? Where are the places of discomfort and fear and hatred and danger for you? Where are the places where you look out and you go, you know what? I ain't going there. And my guess is, we all know some of these folks, right? Like, if we're really being true, we might even identify some of these folks. Like, there are certain neighborhoods and streets in Richmond you ain't going to drive. There might even be some in Chesterfield. You ain't going to drive down. You're not going there. No respectable person would go there willingly. That's how we think of it. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I mean, sure, those are places of fear and danger for us maybe, sadly. But today, I need us to think a little deeper. Because what I'm really talking about is that old friend or that estranged family member that you avoid like the plague. You see them in the store, and you duck behind the very next shelf. You see them out in the neighborhood, and you turn tail and run in the opposite direction. I'm not talking about that street you don't want to drive down. I'm talking about your past, about the buried pain that you avoid and ignore. But then the reality is, it always bubbles up anyway, doesn't it? Typically into some form of unhealthy behavior. I'm talking about the coworker who needs to be confronted, but you're not confrontational, right? You don't do conflict. You don't like conflict. It makes you uncomfortable. So their dysfunction continues, and your work gets more miserable, and the organization gets drugged down. Which, by the way, brings us to another idea in all of this. We in the West tend to make everything an individualized problem. It's always just about me and what's going on with me, but many times these fears, these dangers, are societal and corporate in nature. They impact more than just me. And so we look out and we feel overwhelmed by some of the bigger problems in the world, and we do nothing because of it. It's just too overwhelming. The Nineveh out there is too big. How could we possibly make a difference? But we know it's never going to change until we give more. It's never going to change until we lend our voices and our platforms to certain causes. We know we might even need to actually go and bring relief, but all the what ifs, all the uncertainty, all the damage that might happen to our reputation, the lack of certain safety, it all causes us to turn our backs on the very things that frankly will ultimately make for peace. And this is precisely what Jonah does. The story continues, but Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid his fare and went aboard. Now, it might be helpful to have a little context here. Tarshish is in the exact opposite direction of Nineveh. Nineveh is to the east. That way, that's east. Tarshish is to the west. But it's not just an east and west divide, because Nineveh is only 500 miles that way. I'm going to get out of breath. But Tarshish is more than 5 times further that way. He has the journey of 500 miles versus the journey of 2,500 miles. But it's not just that they're separated in the opposite directions or one is 5 times further away. Did you know Nineveh was built? That ain't Nineveh. I don't have a picture of Nineveh. Nineveh was built on a river in the middle of the desert. It was a walled city, and when you looked at Nineveh in the ancient world, it was nothing but brown around whatever the irrigation channels provided. But Tarshish is literally in the Spanish Riviera, and it looked like that. He ain't just running in the opposite direction or 5 times further. He's taking a vacation. He's on his way to paradise as far as he is concerned. He has found himself a seaside resort, a small town on the Mediterranean where he can sip some red wine and put his feet up. God has called him on a mission to go to Nineveh, and Jonah's response is, you know what? I think I need a vacation. You and I live our lives between Nineveh and Tarshish. You and I spend our days trying to figure out which direction we're going. But God is at work in Nineveh. The call and the mission is happening over there because that's the place with the challenges, and that's the place God needs to begin making right. And so God is over there in Nineveh working to bring justice and peace and love. And far too often, while he's over there working, we get nervous and say, you know, a Mai Tai or a Long Island or whatever your drink of choice is seems a whole lot more appealing. God sees your trouble. He sees your broken heart. He sees the trauma in your past and in the sin that is in your present. And he has no desire for you to carry that mess around. On the corporate level, he sees the poor and the destitute. He sees the forgotten and the oppressed. And do you know what he does? He sends you and me to make things right. He sees Nineveh in our own lives and in the world around us. And he says, that dry, dark place is precisely where I need you. and it's where you need to go. But instead, we choose Tarshish. For whatever reason, I've got too much going on. I can't deal with that right now. And so we turn our backs. We turn our backs on the only path that actually has a chance of restoring the world, of fixing things, of making things right, because that's the broken place. Look, there is a fundamental truth that runs through the entire Bible. I've said it here before, but man, it bears repeating because it's constant. In fact, I wouldn't say it's just in the Bible. It is fundamentally true about human history. And that truth is this. You can run away from Nineveh. You can try to go around Nineveh. But the only way that is going to make a difference is fix things is to go to Nineveh and through Nineveh. Avoiding it, ignoring it, running away from it never makes a difference. It is only when the slaves have the courage to leave Egypt and go through the desert do they find the promised land. It is only where we find a resurrection and new life on Easter Sunday after we have gone through the cross on Good Friday. The reality of the world is this brokenness, this fear, this sin has to be reckoned with. It has to be borne. It has to be endured. And until the Jonahs, you and me, step up and start doing that, it won't get fixed. Violence begets more violence. And it is only when we stand in the way of it, go into Nineveh, that we can break the cycle. The Ninevehs of the world, the Ninevehs of our lives will never change course until you and I lend our voices, our time, our energy, and yes, our money towards holding them accountable and advocating for change. And like it or not, that is precisely what God called Jonah to, and it's precisely what he calls you to. That's where God meets us, not on the beatific, idyllic beaches of Tarshish, but instead he meets us in the dark, dry danger of Nineveh. It's worth pointing out, by the way, what Jonah is actually running away from. Take a look at the text again. I ask you, from what does Jonah really flee? Nineveh? No. To run away from Nineveh is actually to run away from God. That broken relationship you avoid, that homeless person that you don't want to make eye contact with, your past, God wants to meet you right there. Because God is already right there, seeking to make it right. And when you avoid it, when you turn your back on it, when you ignore it, you're not just doing that to Nineveh, you're also doing it to God. We run to Tarshish and we think we're in heaven. But God is in Nineveh. God is there in the darkness working to bring light, and he's asking you to join him there because he presumes that there is light in you that can be shown, whatever the past tense is. We spend so much of our times avoiding hard, dark places, but it's precisely in those places where God does his best work. Now, I want to make sure I'm clear here because I'm not advocating that you be naive or careless, just the opposite. Jonah is exceedingly aware of what awaits him in Nineveh. He fully comprehends the risks. So this is not a message to encourage you to go out and get your car ready to do donuts tonight. I don't want you to push headlong into something that could honestly cause irrevocable harm or damage to you. Because here's the reality. Some of us have trauma that could debilitate us if it's handled carelessly or flippantly. Some of us have relationships that are frankly so toxic, they could endanger our health and well-being. To just casually or cavalierly re-engage in them. Cavalierly, by the way, means to enter something carelessly, right? Cavalierly. Hokily means to enter something responsibly. Sorry, Mike. Look, these things are important. They're huge. These things are scary Ninevehs in our lives, and they ought to be approached with a sense of gravity. Because sometimes the Ninevehs that we have to go into require us to take someone with us, maybe a trusted friend. Sometimes, honestly, the Ninevehs we go into require us to work with a professional. Some of the trauma and brokenness in our lives are so deep, so painful, that we need help. Someone who knows those paths, who understands the way through that darkness. Always, by the way, whether your Nineveh is big or small, you need to approach it prayerfully. God wants to meet us there. And it's in such a dangerous place that we need to be working with him. This is our choice, folks, sometimes daily. The supposed peace and comfort of Tarshish, as far away from God as we can get, or the risk and danger of Nineveh, where God is already at work. And there are a ton of things that can keep us from it. Our prejudices, our hatreds, our fears. But know this, regardless, it's always going to be hard. Yet, Jonah can try to run, but God is going to have God's way, isn't he? I wish we had time, by the way, to go through all of Jonah chapter 1, and because there are a ton of just gems in here. But we're going to have to skip to the end. And if you want to join me this week, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, and looking at the book of Jonah, I would invite you to come up here. We're gonna meet in the Christian Crusaders class, and we're going to work through the text of Jonah, take a little more of a deep dive. But we're just going to jump to the end here, because Jonah's predicament, when you run away from Nineveh and end up and try to go to Tarshish, it's the same predicament we might all find ourselves in if we're not careful. You see, the story, as you might have read a moment ago, the story forces Jonah's boat, his shipmates, his captains, to face an uncomfortable truth. There's no way they can keep going in that direction. The storm is simply too strong. They've ditched their cargo to make the boat lighter. They've switched from sails to rowing, and it's gotten them nowhere. They finally decide that it must be Jonah who has caused them the problem, and so when they confront Jonah, he gives them a way out. He says this. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you." And that's what's happened. And that's what happens. But let me ask you, does anyone in this room actually buy this? Not that it happened, but that this was the way to make the problem go away? I mean, was this really the way to keep the boat moving forward? Couldn't Jonah have said, you know what, fellas? You've already ditched all your cargo. It doesn't matter if you make port. Turn the boat around and take me back. Wouldn't that have been a solution to the problem? Because the point is to get him to Nineveh. But that's not what Jonah does, is it? Jonah looks at these sailors and says, you know what, guys? Throw me in the Mediterranean. He would rather die than have to go face his enemy. There comes a point in our lives where we've walked away from Nineveh for so long. And by walking away from Nineveh, we've walked away from God for so long that it starts to take root in our lives in ways we can't imagine. Our anxieties, our fears, our bigotries, our intolerance can keep us from doing what makes obvious sense. This is a minor example, but it happened just this past week. On Friday, I woke up to a phone call from someone I love very dearly who said, hey, they had been sick for a week and hadn't done anything about it, and just said, hey, would you mind taking me to an urgent care center? So I had to cancel all my plans on Friday, and I drove over, picked this person up. I take them to an urgent care center. What we knew at that point in time was that the symptoms that they were experiencing were much too harsh on them, so they needed something just to relieve the symptoms, just to let them sleep and breathe better, blah, blah, blah. And so we go to the urgent care center. We spend 6 hours getting them through the urgent care center to get the medicine they need, and then I take them home. I finally get to spend some time with my family. We had dinner together, and then on my way home, I called this person I loved, and I said, hey, have you taken the medicine yet? Are you feeling better? And you know what they said to me? I haven't taken the medicine yet, and I'm not going to. I spent 6 hours of my day with you just to get that medicine. Are you kidding me? This is a true story, folks. I lost my mess. What? It turns out there was one side effect, a relatively benign side effect, mind you, listed on this bottle of medicine, and this person was terrified of it and wouldn't take it for that reason. That's a minor example. But you and I live between Nineveh and Tarshish. We live between our fears and where there might be healing, just to make sure I can enjoy the sunrise one more time. And by the way, this point is larger than just their discomfort, because their refusal to face their fear didn't just affect them. Your refusal to face your fears and your Nineveh doesn't just affect you. Jonah put every sailor on that boat at risk. Their lives were in jeopardy because he wouldn't do and go to the place that was scary for him. You may think the resentments, the bitterness, the brokenness, the pain you're hanging on to is only affecting you. Let me assure you, the people around you know that it is not. There are people in the boat with you. And you have a responsibility to go to and through Nineveh, responsibly, carefully, to bring healing and hope, to bring restoration and rightness. You decide to ignore it, and there will be collateral damage. And here's the ultimate truth about you. The further you go from Nineveh, the more you turn your back and go away from God, the more cowardly you will get. What does Jonah say to those people, to those sailors? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and the sea will calm down. If I had been one of those sailors, I would have looked at him and said, throw yourself over, man. Why do you want me to get my hands dirty doing it? Constant turning your back on your Ninevehs will cause moral confusion. It will weaken your resolve in who you are. It will demean and slowly erode your character to the point where your problems become someone else's problems. And even if you get to a point, God forbid, where you are so despairing that the only thing you can imagine is death versus facing your Ninevehs, you still won't have the guts to handle it yourself. You'll put it on them. My guess is you can think of family members and friends and coworkers and people in your life, maybe yourself, who encounter this too, who deal with this, where the Nineveh is too big and scary. And as they have run away, they have put others in harm's way. You and I live between Nineveh and Tarshish, sometimes daily. You have a choice to face the hard thing, to confront the hard truth, to go to the place where there might be danger and risk for you, but knowing that God is there at work, and only there can the world begin to be made right. Brothers and sisters, make that choice. Because if you follow that path, you bring healing and hope to the world. That's why we exist as a church. And so this morning as we close, maybe the first step for you As I mentioned earlier, all of confronting your fear should begin prayerfully. Maybe you just need some prayer this morning. I want to invite you to come. I'm going to freshen up for you. And if you need prayer, please come. Be a part of the movement of God's restoration in the world. Confronting your enemies, facing your fears, overcoming whatever hesitations and anxieties you might have. Would you stand with us as we close our service? Sing and come as you feel led.